I was the only officer in that half-empty room when the operator reported that a sky so crowded his screen turned solid. My training, my orders, and the loose procedures all whispered the same answer. Scheduled bombers, nothing more. I let the plot sit on the table, waiting for a confirmation that no one had taught me to demand. Minutes later, the first distant explosions reached us, and the weight of that silence has never left my hands. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, on the island of Oahu in the territory of Hawaii, the United States Army's aircraft warning system was on a routine Sunday schedule. The weather was clear. Visibility over the northern approaches to Oahu was good. No special alert had been declared. The Army's new long-range search radars, the SCR-270 sets, had been operating for only a short time in an experimental role. They were part of a developing aircraft warning service, intended to detect aircraft approaching the island and pass their position to an information centre near Fort Shafter, where officers would judge the plots and direct fighters if necessary. On the northern tip of Oahu, on a rise called Opana, one of those radars faced out over the Pacific. The SCR-270 set was mounted on trucks, with its antenna raised on a steel frame. Cables routed back to a small operations truck where an oscilloscope screen showed the echoes of aircraft and ships as brief spikes of light. The site was manned that morning by 2 young enlisted men from the Signal Corps. Private Joseph L. Lockhart, 19 years old, was the more experienced operator, though radar itself was new to almost everyone. Private George E. Elliott Jr., 23, had been assigned to the radar detail more recently. Lockhart handled the controls and watched the scope. Elliott stood over a plotting table and marked contacts as grease-pencil symbols on a transparent surface over a map grid. They were near the end of a 24-hour duty period. From noon on Saturday until noon on Sunday, they were responsible for guarding the equipment, and during the early morning window from 4 to 7 for operating it. Most of the time it was quiet work, training flights from the island's airfields, the occasional civilian aircraft, and sometimes nothing at all. At Fort Shafter, about 30 miles to the south, the Army's temporary information centre was housed in a converted building. There, and a small staff of enlisted plotters and duty officers received telephone reports from radar sites around the island. On a large plotting table, they marked bearings and ranges, moving counters along tracks to show the movement of aircraft. By December 1941, the tensions between the United States and Japan were widely known in the military community. Intelligence officers had warned that war in the Pacific was possible, yet no specific warning of an imminent attack on Hawaii had been given to the radar operators or to the junior officers assigned to the information centre. In theory, the new radar chain was meant to extend the island's eyes far beyond the horizon. In practice, it was only partially integrated into operational procedures. The system ran limited hours. The centre at Fort Shafter was not fully staffed around the clock. The fighter squadrons on Oahu were not on a regular state of immediate readiness. On Sunday, December 7th, the routine was even more relaxed. At 4 o'clock, the scheduled radar operating shift came on duty. Plotters at Fort Shafter worked until 700 and then left to eat breakfast at the mess. At Opana, the same hours applied. After 700, the SCR-270 set was usually shut down, and the men waited for the truck that would take them back to camp. That morning, the truck was late. At the information centre, 1 man remained on duty beyond the scheduled time. Private Joseph P. McDonald, a switchboard operator, stayed past the end of his shift. He had been on duty since the early hours, connecting telephone calls and relaying reports from the radar sites to the plotting table. The plotters themselves had gone to breakfast. Their chairs were empty. The map surface was largely clear. Also in the room, seated near the plotting table, was a young pursuit pilot temporarily assigned as an observer. First Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler of the 78th Pursuit Squadron was on only his second day at the information centre. He had received little specific training for the role and no detailed instructions on how to evaluate radar reports. His presence was intended to help connect radar information to fighter operations. In reality, his authority and duties had not been clearly defined. Outside, the Sunday routine on Oahu unfolded as usual. At Pearl Harbor, sailors were preparing for church, inspecting quarters, or resting on decks. At nearby Army airfields such as Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, aircraft were parked wingtip to guard against sabotage. They're not dispersed for an air defence alert. Island defence plans existed on paper, but they were not in motion. Shortly after 7 o'clock, with the scheduled radar operating period officially over, Lockhart and Elliot considered shutting down their set. The night had been mostly uneventful. They had tracked local traffic and refined their handling of the equipment. The truck that was supposed to collect them had not yet appeared. Elliot suggested that they continue to run the radar for practice. Working from the oscilloscope trace gave him extra experience in plotting. Lockhart agreed. There was no harm in keeping the transmitter on for a few more minutes. The SCR-270 antenna continued to rotate, sending pulses of radio energy out over the Pacific. On the oscilloscope, the sweep traced a regular line. Small spikes appeared and faded with each rotation, marking echoes from distant objects. At 7:02, a large, unusual signal appeared on the screen. It was not a single point. It was a thick, moving mass of returns covering much of the range scale. Lockhart watched the trace and adjusted the range. The contact persisted. He shifted to a longer range scale and saw that the echo extended out to roughly 130 miles. The mass appeared as a solid block, indicating many aircraft close together. On the plotting surface, Elliot began to mark the position. Bearing from the site was roughly north, slightly to the east. He recorded the first plot, then the second, as the antenna rotated again. The range was decreasing quickly. Within moments, both men understood that they were tracking a very large formation. They had never seen such a strong return on the set. Training flights and small groups of aircraft had produced only modest spikes. This was different in scale and density. Lockhart continued to monitor the scope. Elliot drew a line of advance across the map. The formation was coming in toward the island along a fairly direct path. They knew that they were beyond their scheduled operating hours. Still, the size of the contact made them reluctant to simply shut down and walk away. There were procedures for reporting significant radar contacts. Each site had a direct telephone line to the information center at Fort Shafter. The normal expectation was that plotters in the center would receive the bearing and range, update the central plot, and a duty officer would decide what action, if any, to take. At Opana, Elliot picked up the telephone and called the information center. On the other end of the line, in the otherwise quiet room at Fort Shafter, MacDonald answered the call at the switchboard. Elliot reported what they were seeing. He gave the bearing from the north 3 points east. He described a large number of planes at long range, coming in toward Oahu. MacDonald understood that this was more than routine local traffic. He reached for a message blank and began to write. Normally, he would have passed the information to the radar plotters at the table, who would mark it and call a duty officer's attention to it. But the plotters were not there. Most of the centre's staff had left for breakfast at 7 o'clock. MacDonald looked around the room. He saw Lieutenant Tyler seated by the plotting table. Tyler was the only officer present. And at this point, the chain of reporting and responsibility began to stretch. The radar site had fulfilled its role by detecting and calling in the contact. The switchboard operator had taken the call, but the normal layer of trained plotters and controllers was absent. MacDonald carried the message toward Tyler. Later testimony would reflect some uncertainty about the exact sequence and timing within those minutes. What is clear is that the information moved more slowly than the incoming aircraft. Meanwhile, on Opana Hill, the radar antenna continued to sweep. Each rotation showed the mass moving closer. The range was decreasing steadily. The line on Elliot's plot extended toward the center of the island. MacDonald spoke to Tyler and summarized the report. A large group of planes was approaching from the north. There was no routine traffic expected from that direction in such numbers. Tyler had little context for interpreting radar plots. He had not been briefed in detail on the capabilities of the SCR-270. He had not been given a clear set of rules for when to scramble fighters, when to alert higher command, or how to distinguish friendly from hostile contacts. He did, however, know that a flight of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from the mainland United States was scheduled to arrive in Hawaii that morning. Those aircraft would approach from the east-northeast after a long overwater flight. Their precise arrival time was approximate. No system existed to display their position on radar ahead of time. With limited information, Tyler concluded that the radar operators were seeing the expected B-17S. He believed they were friendly aircraft. Accounts suggest that he told MacDonald that the report was nothing unusual, or words to that effect, and that the men at the radar should not worry. It was his second day at the center. He did not order a general alert. He did not contact the fighter wing. Back at Opana, the radar plot continued to advance. The formation was now well within 100 miles. The return remained remarkably dense. Lockhart and Elliot had expected their report to trigger some form of reaction. They waited for instruction. The telephone line remained quiet. After a short interval, MacDonald called them back. He spoke directly to Lockhart this time. Lockhart, more experienced on the set, emphasized the size of the contact. He had never seen anything like it. The entire screen was filled. MacDonald sensed his urgency, holding the line. Yet he returned to Tyler to press the matter once more. He reported that the operator at Opana was very concerned and that the contact was unusually large. This was the moment in which the radar plot, the shift change, and the search for confirmation intersected. A single junior officer with minimal training and partial information had to decide whether to escalate the report, wake senior commanders, and potentially order fighters into the air. The time was somewhere around 7:20 local time. The Japanese strike force, the first wave of the attack, was already well on its way toward Oahu at high speed. Tyler again concluded that the contact was almost certainly the inbound B-17CS. He did not have access to precise data on the bomber flight's location. He did not have radar identification tools to distinguish friendly and hostile aircraft. Well, with those constraints, he chose not to interpret the radar return as evidence of an attack. From the perspective of the radar operators, the radar plot had been passed to the center. From the perspective of the information center, the report had been received but not considered a trigger for immediate action. In the gap between those positions, the radar track effectively waited for confirmation that never came. As the minutes passed, the formation moved closer. On the oscilloscope, the spikes grew broader. At some point shortly before 7:40, the operators began to lose clarity as ground clutter and interference increased near the island. The radar set was not optimized for tracking targets close in. Elliot marked the final plot on the board. The line of advance ended near the northern coastline of Oahu. With the contact no longer visible, and with no additional instructions received, the two men prepared to shut down the set and leave for breakfast. At Fort Shafter around 7:40, MacDonald was relieved by another operator. He left the switchboard and returned to his tent, where he woke his roommate and mentioned that a large number of planes had been coming in from the north. It was still a calm Sunday morning on the island. When the attack on Pearl Harbor began shortly after 7:55, it came first as a distant sound to many observers. Engines at high power, bombs falling, explosions echoing over the harbour and the airfields. At Opana, Lockhart and Elliot were already on the road to their breakfast point when they first heard about the attack. They turned back toward the radar site and resumed operating the SCR-270 to track further aircraft movements during the attack. At Fort Shafter, the information centre filled rapidly as personnel returned from breakfast or were called to duty. The plotting table became crowded with counters and marks. Telephone lines carried urgent reports from across the island. It was now clear that Japanese aircraft were attacking, and the radar role shifted from early warning to immediate tracking. Only later, in these air investigations that followed, would officials reconstruct the precise sequence of events between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock that morning. They would examine the radar records, the testimony of the operators, and the decisions taken at the information center. The original radar plot from Station Opana, showing the line of approaching aircraft plotted from 7:02 onward, was preserved and later submitted as evidence to a joint congressional committee. On it, investigators could see the formation advancing towards the island in a series of plotted points, approaching within range before the track ended. The inquiries did not focus solely on the individuals present that morning. They also examined the broader system in which those individuals were working. At the time of the attack, the radar network on Oahu was still in a developmental stage. The information center was operating on limited hours, and its staffing did not reflect a fully mature round-the-clock alert system. Commanders had not fully integrated radar into their defensive planning. The procedure for handling early morning reports was not clearly codified. For the radar operators at Opana, the inquiries affirmed that they had made the correct decision in reporting the contact. Lockhart and Elliot had detected and tracked the incoming formation for more than half an hour. They had called the information center promptly and emphasized the unusual scale of the plot. MacDonald's actions at the switchboard also received attention. He had remained at his post beyond his scheduled shift. He had taken the call, passed the message to the duty officer, and then called back to the radar site when no action seemed forthcoming. His efforts to seek confirmation and escalation were later recognized. For Lieutenant Tyler, the investigations were more complex. Some early commentary tended to focus on his decision as a central failure, portraying him as the officer who dismissed a vital warning. Her later reviews, including a Naval Board of Inquiry and subsequent assessments, emphasized that he had been placed in a difficult position without adequate preparation, supervision, or staff. They noted that he was new to the information center work and that the system itself had not set clear expectations for interpreting radar data. The question of whether the warning from Opana, if acted upon, could have significantly changed the outcome of the attack has been discussed by historians. Analyses have examined the distance of the formation at first detection, the time needed to scramble fighters from Oahu's airfields, and the readiness of those units. Many studies suggest that at best, an earlier alert might have allowed some fighters to get into the air, as possibly disrupting parts of the attack or inflicting additional losses on the incoming aircraft. Others point out that the overall strategic surprise, the concentration of ships in the harbour, and the configuration of defences would still have produced heavy damage. The story of the radar plot therefore occupies a particular place in the broader account of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It does not stand as a simple explanation for the events of the day. Instead, it illustrates how new technology, human judgment, institutional procedures, and timing interacted in a brief critical window. For the men involved, the aftermath lasted long beyond that morning. Joseph Lockhart continued to serve in the Army Signal Corps. He was promoted, attended officer candidate school, and later served as a radar officer in the Aleutian Islands, as putting his technical experience to use in another theatre of the war. After the war, he worked in private industry and registered numerous patents over the course of his career. George Eliot's wartime service also continued. His early hours on Opana Hill remained a defining incident, but like many veterans, he returned to civilian life after the war, with limited public attention to his experience. Joseph McDonald served in the Central Pacific on a series of islands as the war advanced westward. For many years, his role in the radar warning remained little known outside official records. Decades later, his efforts to raise the alarm were formally recognized with an Army Commendation Medal presented posthumously to his family. Kermit Tyler remained in the military, and eventually transferring to the newly created United States Air Force and retiring as lieutenant colonel. In later interviews, he described the events of the morning and his reasoning at the time, stating that he deeply regretted the outcome but had made his judgment based on what he knew and understood in that moment. The site at Opana itself changed over the years. The mobile radar trucks that had stood there in 1941 were long gone. In later decades, parts of the hill were used for other communications facilities. There were no large structures to indicate that it had once been at the centre of an early warning story. Eventually, the Opana radar site was recognised as a National Historic Landmark and an IEEE milestone in the history of radar. A commemorative plaque today notices that the first wartime operational use of radar by the United States took place there on the 7th of December, 1941. The original radar plot from that morning, preserved in the records of the United States Congress, provides a visual record of the sequence of events. The plotted line shows how, between 7:02 and roughly 7:39, the formation approached steadily. The mark stopped before the coastline, reflecting the point at which the radar could no longer track the incoming aircraft clearly. Looking at that plot, one can see how the technical system did what it was designed to do. The radar detected the approaching aircraft at long range. The operators documented their movement. The telephone connection carried the report to the centre. What the system could not provide in that stage of its development was an automatic linkage between detection and action. Human interpretation was required at every stage. Training, doctrine, and institutional habits shaped those interpretations. On Oahu that Sunday, several separate warnings emerged in the hours and minutes before the attack. A destroyer reported engaging a submarine near the harbour entrance. Intelligence staff in Washington and Hawaii had been tracking diplomatic messages that suggested rising tension. The radar plot from Opana showed a large formation inbound. In isolation, each piece could be explained. Taken together, they painted a picture of approaching danger. However, they were not successfully integrated in time. In later decades, the story of the radar warning has often been told with an emphasis on the missed opportunity. Yet in the lives of the men at Opana and Fort Shafter, it was also a story of routine duty performed under ordinary conditions that suddenly intersected with an extraordinary event. Lockhart and Elliot began that morning expecting a quiet end to a long shift. They were practicing with a new machine on a hilltop as the sun rose over the Pacific. When the unusual contact appeared, they responded according to their training, following the procedures they had been given. MacDonald, remaining at his post past his allotted time, did what he could within the limits of his authority. He passed the message, sought out an officer, and called back to the radar site when he sensed that the warning had not received the response its urgency warranted. Tyler, placed in a role for which he had not been properly prepared, made a judgment that would be scrutinized for the rest of his life. His decision not to raise an alarm was shaped by incomplete information, a lack of clear doctrine, and an understandable, if ultimately incorrect, assumption about a scheduled flight of friendly bombers. The radar plot itself, drawn in grease pencil on a transparent surface over a map, was erased later that day as new tracks and reports crowded the plotting table. Its surviving counterpart, the paper copy submitted as evidence, remains a fixed record of a moment when technology saw far beyond the horizon, but the institutions around it did not yet know how to fully respond. In the broader arc of the war, the development and integration of radar into air defense systems would advance rapidly. By the middle years of the conflict, the radar chains and filter rooms in various theaters were staffed around the clock, guided by developed procedures and linked directly to fighter control. The lessons of early experiences, including those at Opana, contributed to that evolution. Yet in December 1941, on that quiet Sunday morning on Oahu, radar was still partly experimental, its operational role still in formation. The men who operated it, relayed its signals, and interpreted its plots were working within that transitional state. The story of the radar plot that waited for confirmation between shift change and attack is therefore a story of timing and structure as much as of individual choice. The minutes between 7:02 and 7:40 show how quickly events can move and how slowly a system not fully prepared can react. For the faceless figures at the oscilloscope and the plotting table, the experience was brief but enduring. They had seen, before most others, the approach of the force that would strike Pearl Harbor. Their efforts were recorded, questioned, and eventually acknowledged. On the hillside above the North Shore, the wind still moves across the ground where the radar trucks once stood. There is no rotating antenna there now. But the line drawn on that December morning from distant contact to lost track remains part of the historical record of the day the Pacific War began for the United States.